Hi guys, thank you for joining us today for our expert series talk for the month of February. So this expert series talks is to be able to give people the knowledge and students about the type of research that's going on out in the United States or around the world, and how this research could be very implemented could be very useful and be implemented. And it would also be good for students to be able to get a better awareness on that research does do a difference in the world. So today we have Dr. Seeta Sistla, and I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a brief little bio about her. So she is an assistant professor in natural resources management and environmental sciences at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, California. Dr. Sisla's research focuses on quantifying how global environmental changes factors impact on terrestrial systems. She is currently leading research projects in a diversity of systems, ranging from quantifying the impacts of increasing fire frequency in the Yukon. How am I gonna say this wrong? Or in the Delta area, Arkansas, to documenting the extent of plastic pollutions and its biological consequences in agricultural systems. Seeta received her PhD from UC Santa Barbara as a DOE Global Change Program Graduate Fellow, and was a NOAA Global Climate Change postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine. Before joining Cal Poly, Dr. Sistla was a professor at Hampshire College in Amherst. Did I say that right? Amherst, Massachusetts. Okay, and with that, I will go ahead and send the microphone over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here today. Hi, everyone. And since it's a small group and I know there's some folks in the background there, feel free to just unmute and ask a question if you want. As Anita said, I'm a faculty member here at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo on the central coast of California. And today I'm going to be talking to you about an area of pollution research that you may not be super familiar with, which is plastic pollution in soil environments. So what is happening? Where is it coming from? And what are some of the consequences of this novel pollutant in our land systems? And so before I go into the talk, I just want to give a quick moment for acknowledgement. So this work was really spearheaded by my former graduate student who now works as an environmental consultant, Olivia McKay. Dr. Ekta Tiwari is a postdoctoral fellow who has started on the project last spring and has been making huge inroads. And then our lab technician, Gemma Forshaw, is really the linchpin who holds the lab together and has helped do a lot of the field sampling and also laboratory analyses. And this work is really collaborative. I'm going to be talking to you about a small amount of the kinds of data that we're collecting, but it's funded and the research is supported by a variety of sponsors. So the Agricultural Research Institute of the California State University System, the USDA Specialty Crop Research Initiative grant, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and then we have a bunch of collaborators, including the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, and Washington State University. And you may just be noticing from those collaborators that's a mix of universities from around the country, as well as things related to water. So the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. And the reason for that connection to water is because one of our focal areas is trying to ultimately understand the connection between agriculturally derived plastic pollution and water systems. And so we'll come back to that at the end, but in case you're wondering why such a weird variety of collaborators. So just to give you a little bit of background on plastics in the environment. So plastic, generally speaking, is an artificial polymer. So it comes from, it's derived from the Greek word for plastic. So being able to be malleable or changeable, right? So we had the word plastic in our lexicon before we had plastics as we know them today. And right now on Earth, there's about 9.2 billion tons of plastic that have been created since the 1950s to up to about 2017. And more than half of this 9.2 billion tons is estimated to have been produced since 2004. So within the last 2 decades. So if you think about the sort of production of plastics globally, that's a huge exponential growth in plastic production. And I think many of us who have lived for more than 2 decades are sort of at least subconsciously aware of this extraordinary growth of plastics in the everyday environment. And so we see a lot of different plastics. So I have on the screen here just a couple of different varieties. So PET, high density polyethylene, PVC, low density polyethylene, polypropylene, polystyrene. So these are all plastics that are commonly made into things that we use every day, from bottles and pipes and things that are used in lab or biomedical settings, to the computers we're using, to the clothes we're wearing. So it's probably impossible for you to actually go through your day without encountering some sort of plastic that you're using in your everyday items. It's really become embedded within the fabric of our lives, both literally in our clothing and sort of more generally speaking in terms of the use of objects that are ubiquitous throughout our lives. And again, plastics as an artificial polymer are something that has been created in the 20th century, right? So before the 20th century, before the 1930s and 40s, there were no plastics around. People didn't have plastics available to them. So this is a fundamental frame shift in a technology availability that became very rapidly embedded in the human populations globally. And we find plastic particles, I'm sure if you guys have seen the news over the last year, there's been an uptick in sort of sampling of plastics in the environment and microplastics. And we see plastics everywhere, even in the air at the top of Mount Everest and ice sheets everywhere. There's plastic particles floating around the biosphere now. And again, this is fully produced by people. And just to remind you, plastics are used because they have value, right? They're thermally and electrically insulating. They're relatively low cost to produce. These are carbon dense materials that are byproducts of fossil fuel production. Like, so they are extracted. The materials that are used to produce plastics are already being extracted for other purposes. They're resistant to chemicals and to shock. They have a high strength to weight ratio, ease of manufacturing, and durability and versatility. And so we use plastics in a lot of things because they're useful and because functionally, at least when they're in large sizes, so like the kinds of sizes, like for instance, like the back of this phone, they're inert, right? Like they don't chemically react. They're pretty shelf stable. They're strong. So there are reasons that we use plastic in everyday environments. And just to remind you, plastics are not just a single material. One of the complexities for being able to reuse plastics or recycle plastics is that they have a lot of things added to them. And so there's other components beyond just the carbon molecules or the carbon atoms that make the plastic polymer that are used to sort of create the chemical and physical properties of plastics. So we add light and heat stabilizers, different lubricants, adhesives, colorants, flame retardants, etc. And so there's other chemistry that goes into making these plastics to give them the sort of qualities they need. But what we see is that when we make these plastics of very specific sort of physical and chemical properties, they become really hard to recycle, partly because they're a mishmash of these different additives and the base material, the polyethylene or the polystyrene, etc. So the long story short is that we have a lot of plastic. Again, about 9.2 billion tons is estimated to have been produced globally since the 50s, with more than half being produced since 2004 of our 9+ billion tons of plastic. So there's a lot circulating in the world, and it's difficult to reuse or recycle multiple times because of the nature of the plastic polymers being simple chains for the polymers, but then mixed with additives to give them those special chemical and physical characteristics. And so you probably have heard that plastic is accumulating in water environments, right? So we see this if you guys are coastal or have been able to go to beaches lately, either river, lakes, or our oceans, you'll often see plastic accumulating on the, on those lakefront or beachfront areas because it's a very visible interface, right? So we see garbage accumulating that's plastic derived. We see this in terms of the personal protective equipment. So people start to notice a ton of masks and other forms of PPE that were being accumulated on roadsides, neighborhoods, out of trash cans, etc., during the peak of the COVID epidemic. And again, I think that that was representative of our general use of plastic, but was maybe more obvious because it was a type of material that we don't normally see. So like face masks, house masks, were not something that was normally seen out and about in the environment. So people were more cognizant of it, although it's surrounded by other types of plastic garbage. So we know that plastic is accumulating, in our land systems and particularly in our water systems. And we've heard about like the garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere, organisms ingesting large amounts of plastic. There was just a humpback whale in Hawaii that was found dead, and the autopsy revealed enormous amounts of plastic debris in its stomach and intestines, which is a probable cause of death. These have been well known for some time now, partly because it's obvious to see the material when it's in water or on the surface of landscapes. But what we now know is that in addition to water and our surfaces being a sink for plastic garbage and plastic debris, plastic is also accumulating in our soils. And so this publication, Microplastic in Terrestrial Ecosystems and the Soil, ? It's from 2012, and it's one of the first major papers, scientific papers that kind of highlighted this question at the time of like how much microplastics, so small pieces of plastic, are accumulating in the soil environment. And since then, there have been a lot of papers that have come out suggesting that microplastics and larger fragments of plastic are in fact accumulating in soils. And one of the places that they're accumulating that is of particular interest to me, and I think particular interest to anyone who eats, is in agricultural soils. And so this shows just a couple of different papers. So these are scientific papers that have come out more recently. So this is 2012, this is 2020, 2017. I can't remember when that one is, and then I think 2020 or 2019. And so this is just different articles that are showcasing this idea that plastic, either through the application of plastic directly to soils, which we'll talk about, or through the application of sludge and fertilizers that are embedded with plastic particles, is accumulating in the soil environment and in agricultural soils. And what we see as of last year is that the UN FAO has come out with a statement saying that plastic is a threat to food security, health, and the environment. So there is now a recognition that we are living in a world where there is so much plastic accumulating not just in the visible areas like on the beach or piling up in the ocean, but in non-visible areas as well, within soil systems, that this is potentially a threat to our global food supply and our global health. And so something needs to be done. And what needs to be done and what is happening very rapidly right now are campaigns to substantially reduce plastic. And so I'm going to talk about, so these campaigns involve, switching to biodegradable materials, which we can talk about later. They have their own issues and some potential successes associated with biodegradable plastics and innovations in biodegradable plastics. Also, I think the key to reducing plastic waste is reducing plastic consumption, which we can talk about later. But what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk is really focusing on plastics in agricultural systems. Why are they accumulating? What are some of the biological impacts of these plastics at large scales and at smaller scales? And where do we go from here? And the reason that I'm focusing on plastics in ag is because I think that folks they think about packaging. So like when you buy, a cucumber or something that's individually wrapped in cellophane, and you may think like, well, that's a real waste because that's a single-use plastic that then immediately goes in the garbage just to keep my cucumber from touching another cucumber. Or if you have those plastic clamshells that hold berries, and we think about plastic waste with food, I think in terms of packaging, but the other side of food production that people maybe aren't as familiar with, but that is definitely a huge part of the food plastic waste industry is the actual production of this material. And so the picture behind this image here, which shows the outline of the talk, is actually showing garbage, plastic that's ripped off of fields and is just sitting in a fallowed area. And like the long-term fate of that material is to sit either on the soil there or to be transported to a landfill, or if it's not being properly processed, to be burned or otherwise incinerated. And so these are not good fates for this material, but that is the reality of plastic use across the globe in the US and elsewhere. And this is a picture from California. And so to give you sort of an overview, I'm going to just refer to this idea of plastic culture. And so what plastic culture refers to, and you probably have never heard this word, but it really, I think, does kind of represent what we're facing in terms of agricultural production this century, is the ubiquitous use of plastic in the growing of food. And so if you had to think like, well, how is plastic used to grow food? You might come up with the idea of greenhouses or hothouses, right? So for those of you who are from more northern latitudes or have planted things over the winter, you know that if you make like hoop houses or greenhouses, that you can start seeds early or do flower production or other forms of production. And so we know that plastic culture from greenhouses is an issue, but those greenhouses are stable for hopefully multiple years. They don't come out year after year, although there is breakdown of the material from these greenhouses that are on the landscape. The other part of plastic in the food production is actually through the use of plastic mulches. And so the picture on your right here, this picture is showing strawberries, one of the most profitable specialty crops in California, certainly on the Central Coast where I am located. And the way that strawberries are grown commercially at scale pretty much inevitably uses plastic at this point. And so why are they using plastic? So the plastic keeps the plant from being in direct contact with the soil, the leaves. It reduces disease incidence. It increases water use efficiency. It reduces the need for fumigants to be applied, et cetera. So there are positive benefits to having your plants growing through this bed of plastic, right? The problem is that the plastic use has exploded, and it's not just used now for specialty crops, it's used for a variety of other crops. So I'm from upstate New York, and I've been chatting with some folks from Western New York, from Cornell and agricultural extension agencies in Western New York, and they were telling me that plastic is being used now with strawberries, and other, or not strawberries, sorry, tomatoes and other crops, where I know from having grown up in the 80s in upstate New York, no one put plastic down on their fields to grow tomatoes. But now, to extend the growing season, to make the soil a little bit warmer, a little bit longer, people are using plastic as bedding in lots of different crop systems. And the same thing is happening all over the world. So globally, plastic film mulch is exceeding about 1.5 million tons annually. And that material is put down at the beginning of a growing season. The plants are planted into the rows that are created and held together by the mulch. And then that plastic becomes a waste product, right? It's ripped up at the end of the year and is garbage. So you have this constant cycle of plastic garbage in the production of food to support, an increase potentially in yield at that time. But the question is, what is the long-term effect of repeatedly applying these sheets of plastic to the fields? And so in California alone, and these are old estimates, these are from more than 10 years ago, so it's probably more since then. It's estimated that California farmers are disposing of over 55,000 tons of plastic annually. And this is through the ripping of that material off of the field. So if you look at this picture here, this is up in the Watsonville area. And what you can see is that there's no plastic, right, on these rows because it's all been ripped up. So this ocean of strawberry fields, all that plastic is being ripped up and disposed of, right? It's not being recycled, it's becoming garbage. And And we see that strawberries, so strawberries alone accounted for over 10,000 tons of plastic waste, and then greenhouses and nurseries another 11,000 tons. And again, these are old estimates, so I would increase those numbers since then I'm trying to get new numbers. It's a little bit difficult to get good estimates of how much plastic is used in agriculture because it changes year to year. And we can see that it's not just mulch, you also have drip tape. So this is an image of the mulch being carted away, and then the drip tape, and there's another truck of plastic mulch. And so this is a big deal, but it's also a hugely profitable and important industry for the Central Coast of California, and farming in general is an incredibly important industry globally. And so you have this balance between producing crops in the way that people are accustomed to and at the scale that people are accustomed getting access to, but also this hidden externality of adding a lot of plastic waste into the global plastic waste system. And so the question is there an effect in addition to the plastic that's being ripped off of the landscape and put into landfills, which are filling up all over California and elsewhere? Is there also an effect on the soil itself of having all this plastic directly applied year in, year out, year in, year out? And so when we look at plastics, we know now, and I hope you're convinced, that this is really a global pollution burden. So plastics are ubiquitous across all biomes globally, and this includes the most remote landscapes on Earth. So I can assure you, having worked in the Arctic, in very northern latitudes, that we see plastic debris and plastic waste even very, very, very far away from human settlements, because it moves, and because it's inert, it's stable for decades to centuries to thousands of years. It doesn't break down easily. As I've said, it's really an essential part of modern agriculture, and it's useful, right? It reduces disease and water stress in plants. Like, there's reasons that people apply mulches to fields. But now estimates are coming out that plastic contamination in land systems may be 4 to over 20 times greater than in aquatic systems. And so again, our focus of global plastic pollution historically has been in water systems, partly because it was easy both to see the plastic and also to see the effects of the plastic on marine and aquatic organisms. But now we're realizing that soils are potentially the largest physical sink of plastics globally, not water systems. And the extent of plastic pollution in agricultural landscapes is really only very recently being recognized. Really within the last decade or even 5 years has there been a string of research showcasing that there is a lot of plastic accumulating in our agricultural soils. And we see that there are diverse sources. So I talked to you about the plastic culture, right? The use of plastic in the production of food, but we also see plastic coming in from other sources. So in sludge or bio-waste that are used as fertilizers, from runoff from other sources, and even wind dispersals. So for those of you who, may be near farmlands, when that wind rips across, it pulls up some of that topsoil, and it's going to pull any plastic that's associated with it at the surface and move it, right? So we see the movement of plastic both in and out of the agricultural environment through wind dispersal. Part of the complexity of trying to figure out how much plastic is actually ending up in agricultural soils and where is it coming from and what are the consequences is that it's pretty diverse. So common types of plastic that are found in agricultural systems and more generally in our biome include polyethylene, polyvinyl chloride or PE and PVC, polystyrene and polyesters, and they have different sizes. They also have different sort of chemical characteristics. So some plastics are associated with leachates like phthalates or with pesticide accumulation so that they can actually chelate or stick pesticides to them. And so, or heavy metals or other contaminants. And so there's a lot going on with the chemistry and the physical aspects of plastic, which makes it challenging to characterize, especially when you're looking at what's going on in our soils, which are the basis of our food network. And so today we're going to focus mostly on larger scale plastic fractions, but I want to talk a little bit about the scales, because I know that many of you have heard about microplastics lately, like microplastics in the environment, microplastics in our water. There's actually, California is at the front edge of leading regulations to test for microplastics in drinking water. So we are leading the charge as a state in the nation. And we care about plastics of different sizes because size matters when you're thinking about the chemistry and physical impacts and physicochemical impacts of a material on health and on the environment. So microplastics are debris. So these can be fragments, fibers, or pellets that are small. So smaller than 5 millimeters is generally the way we think about it. So if you think about your scale, so less than 5 millimeters is your microplastics. So 5 millimeters is small, but still visible, but like pretty small. So when it's mixed again into the soil environment, it might be very challenging to see because soils are not transparent, right? So it's harder to see those small particles. You can then go from micro to nano. And so nano is typically defined as a particle size of less than 1,000 nanometers. And these exhibit collido behavior. And so what that means is that these are, when you get particles that get very, very small, their surface area to volume increases. So this is just a law of scaling. And so they tend to be more reactive or have different chemical properties than at the larger sizes. They tend to be less inert or more reactive as their surface area to volume changes. And we'll talk more about this later on. And then you have these in between, these microplastics and nanoplastics. So one of the challenges with these smaller size classes is that they are hard to detect in the soil environment. It's really hard to quantify them, to count how many there are per unit soil. It's also really hard to identify who they are, so their identity. And we have a bunch of different chemical and analytical techniques to try to identify them, but this is something that my lab and others are still working on, trying to understand what is there and how much of it is there to quantify it. But as I said, as you get into these smaller size classes, these micro nanoparticles, you have a higher surface area to volume, and that is potentially therefore more hazardous than these larger fragments because they can both be biologically active. So when you get really, really tiny, you can get through cell membranes. Larger surface areas allows for larger absorption or binding absorption with contaminants, and then they can move contaminants. So things like heavy metals or pesticides or other things that might be either leaching from water or otherwise in the soil environment. And so we know that microplastics can have negative effects on plants and soils. And so there has been a series of studies that have come out recently showing that when we add microplastics to soil environments, we get weird biological responses. And so this is just an image. This isn't from my work. This is from another lab from Liang et al. From 2021, a couple of years ago. And this is a published paper that's showing basically the effects of different microplastics. So no MF is no microplastic fragments, no fibers. And then these are different. This is polyethylene and polyacrylamide. So these are 3 different types of plastic microplastic fibers. And what they found was that in soils that had very little organic matter, so that are not very rich soils, just like not very rich in carbon content, like not soils you'd want to garden with, for instance, when you added these microplastics versus the control, the no microplastic fibers, the water stable aggregates. So water stable aggregates are like how the soil forms a structure that helps with biological activity and plant growth. So you want soils to have structure to them, not to just like fall apart, because that structure is what helps support biological activity in soils. And what they found was that in really, really low organic matter systems where there's not much carbon to begin with, adding microplastics didn't really affect the formation of these aggregates, which is a biological process that happens as microbes and roots turn over and die. What they found when they added different organic matter inputs, so these are different plant materials, so straw, hemp, plantago, and medicago, is that the aggregate formation started to go down. So basically that the microplastics being present in the soils inhibited the formation of the aggregates. And they suggested that this may be due to the fact that they're inhibiting some of this biological activity in the soil. A more sort of clear-cut example of the effects of microplastics on soils came from a different study from Boot et al. From 2019. And what they found was that when they added microplastics, they reduced, this is in a greenhouse experiment, like a potting experiment, they reduced plant growth and biomass, chlorophyll content, germination success, and below ground, they had a reduction in root biomass, earthworm biomass, so they had earthworms in their little incubations. Soil structure was affected, and also pH. So a bunch of different biological and sort of non-biological traits of the soil and plant system were directly affected, or seem to be directly affected, by the presence of microplastics in the soil system. So we see evidence, and again, these are very recent papers. So science is a conservative field, right? Like empirical science, it takes time to really understand the relationships between different pollutants and their effects, especially in the environment, which has a lot of other noise going on in it. But what we see is that there is some evidence from a bunch of different studies now that plastics are both accumulating in land systems, and that they have deleterious effects, bad effects. And so we also see that they can transfer along the food chain. So again, this is of interest to people who eat, which I think is everyone who's listening today. So what we see is that there are studies that have suggested that plastic that's in soils can be ingested by small organisms. So for instance, earthworms, invertebrates, and then that plastic then gets transferred up trophic levels to, say, chickens, because the chickens eat the invertebrates who are eating the plastic, and then they accumulate the plastic. And then who eats the chickens? People eat the chickens. So in theory, what we see is that there can be a transfer and a bioaccumulation of plastic, of microplastic pieces along food webs that are starting in the soil environment. So there, as I said, has been a lot of work, and my lab is pursuing work on these impacts of small plastic fragments, these microplastics in the soil environment. But one thing that was interesting to me is, what about larger plastic fragments? And so this was really motivated by my graduate student and I going out to fields in California and seeing something. What we saw was that in soils that had plastic previously, there was a lot of plastic still left behind. And so what these images are showing are just pictures of large visible fragments. So those bigger than 5 millimeter fragments that are clearly visible on the soil surface, that are just accumulating in and around fields, because when you rip the plastic off, it doesn't get removed completely. So anyone has dealt with soil or garden, or just been outside, will notice that soil sticks to things. And so if you have plastic sitting on the ground for a growing season, when you rip it off, some of it, no matter how good the farmer or the practitioner is in trying to remove it, some of it will get left behind just by the nature of the material. It becomes brittle and it becomes enmeshed within the soil that was sitting on, and so parts get left behind, and we see these fragments accumulating. And so we became curious, like, how much plastic is accumulating that is visible, and what are some of the effects of that? There have been some studies coming out from Asia suggesting that the application of these mulches, these large plastic sheets, over and over and over again may have deleterious effects on a whole suite of important things from a human perspective. So this study found that as the amount of residual plastic film in fields increases, so the amount of film that was used, plastic mulch that was used over time, and this is in kilograms per hectare, so up to 1,000 plus kilograms per hectare, what they found was that there tended to be lower yields of some key crops, reduced plant height, reduced crop root weight, reduced phosphate, reduced P availability, things that are sort of important for long-term crop success. So in China is the largest single user of plastic mulches globally. And what this study was arguing with that, while there are benefits to using plastic in the short term, their study suggests that over time there may be really deleterious effects on the soil environment and thus on plant health from having these plastic residues accumulate in cropping systems. And so our lab, our first big project in plastics in the soil, was trying to understand what were the macroplastic fragments doing. And we wanted to know whether having prolonged sort of leaving all this plastic behind in the soil over time, as you can see this woven through, this is in field that's not active, there's all these chunks just sitting in there. We wanted to know like what was happening on the plastic, on the soils that were associated with that plastic versus the soils around the plastic. So, and we hypothesized that if you were a soil that was in direct contact with this plastic that was left behind, this debris over long periods of time, that you would have some deleterious effects on microbial activity, nutrient availability, and other sort of important soil properties relative to the bulk soil. And then we want to test the relationship between this plastic contamination and other properties. And so for the sake of time, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know you guys, it's a Saturday morning, but we set out first to study plastic contaminated fields. So we identified with the help of some stakeholders, farms that had fields that were contaminated with plastic, either because of intentional tilling into the soil or because they were fallowed with standing plant biomass and the plastic was left behind. And so we knew we had a few fields where there was a lot of plastic debris in them. And then we set out using a transit design. So for those students who have been doing environmental monitoring, I'll show you a picture of what we did to basically survey the amount of plastic fragments in the soil and assess how the soil that was touching that plastic was behaving relative to the bulk soil around it. And so this is our transit design. We walked through the field, we laid transects, and then we laid these grids. And within each grid, we collected all of the plastic that we could find. And we collected soil samples as well from the parts that were not touching plastic. And what we found was a lot of plastic. So in these fields, we found upwards of 80,000 visible pieces, just visible on the surface, not having to dig, just surface plastic. We found upwards of 80,000 pieces of the mulch, the polyethylene, and over almost 14,000 pieces of other plastics, so PVC, HDPE, other plastics in the soil environment. So this is a picture here with all the mulches in white and then blue showing another type of plastic, probably PVC. And so we then went and sampled all of this plastic and we picked it all up. And then we sampled 5-centimeter deep cores that were not touching plastic. And we separated out all of the plastic and weighed it, we measured it, and then we took the soil that was adhesed to it, and we studied how that soil was behaving relative to the bulk soil that hadn't been visibly touching these larger plastic fragments. And then we did some analyses and looked at some of the soil properties that were relevant to soil health and plant growth for the plastic touching soil and for the bulk soil. And what we found was kind of interesting. So again, we hypothesized that if the soil was directly contacting these plastic pieces, which could be, associated with pesticide residues, heavy metal residues, otherwise, we assumed it was going to be deleterious for the soil quality based on those other studies that we'd also read. But what we found was kind of surprising. We found that under drip line or surface mulch fragments, that microbial biomass, so the decomposers that are responsible for nutrient cycling in the soil, were actually higher. Their biomass, the amount of them, was higher in the plastic associated soil than the bulk soil. So the plastic contaminated soil that was not directly touching these macro fragments. But we found that respiration was lower. So basically there was a non-significant but declining effect of soil respiration having to do with these plastic associated fragments. And so what this meant when you put this data together was that microbial efficiency was actually a little bit higher. So I know that this is a ratio that looks lower, but what this means is that the decomposer biomass is respiring less per unit biomass. So there are more efficient biomass that's associated with these plastic fragments than is in the surrounding bulk soil. We also found that there was a higher carbon labile carbon and inorganic nitrogen pools. So these are, again, important parts of the soil quality for plant growth and nutrition. We found that, again, the plastics seem to support a sort of higher nutrient value soil than the surrounding bulk plastic contaminated soil. And we were surprised by this. We also found that the percent carbon, percent nitrogen was also higher in the soil. But what we think was happening was that basically when you have these large plastic fragments building up in the soil, they're providing an unusual surface area for microbial colonization. And even though we didn't detect it in our study, a slightly moister or more wet environment for these microbes to be growing, for the soil, for microbes to be growing then in the bulk soil. So all of these soils were collected during the summer and during a drought period. And so what we think is basically that these plastics were actually acting as a little microhabitat that was separate and distinct from the bulk soil, but maybe was actually a hotspot. And this study, which is not from me, this is from a different group from 2019, found that a similar thing, that they found that on these large plastic fragments, there was all these pitting and grooving and flaking, and that it was actually allowing microbial colonization in novel areas compared to the soil environment. So unexpected, but maybe explainable. And so again, we found that at the large scale, these large fragments, which had not been as well characterized as the microplastic effects, the fragments were supporting a novel habitat for the soil microbes. Whether this is good for the soil, though, is another question. There was no indication that having this microhabitat on the plastics that is maybe doing a little bit better than the bulk soil has confers benefits to the overall soil environment. We don't know, and we didn't know, we're exploring this right now, whether the larger plastic fragments are associated with hotspots of microplastics. So basically, could we be seeing a reduction in soil health and soil quality because the macroplastics, as they get broken down through physical degradation, are releasing microplastics into the soil environment? And how does this relate to those other studies suggesting that plastic accumulation in soils is reducing yields when it's across large scales? So we want to try to understand whether we could understand in more detail what was happening in these fields that are accumulating a lot of plastic fragments, and whether, even though at the macroplastic scale, it may not be actually, quote unquote, bad for soil health in the way that we were able to detect, whether these are basically becoming a hotspot for microplastics, which over time could have deleterious effects on the soil environment. And so right now we're following up this work, trying to understand how plastics across plastics across California agricultural fields are accumulating and what their consequences are at different scales, and then what are the possibilities of plastic alternatives. And so we're continuing our work trying to study how plastic contaminated California agricultural fields are. We're trying to connect the relationship between large plastic fragments and these smaller plastic particles to ecosystem functions and agricultural productivity. I am working with a graduate student from the University of Tennessee, studying how biodegradable plastic alternatives that are available commercially are behaving in terms of their viability as a mulch, and then how they break down, how they actually break down in soils, and whether increasing exposure of soils to these biodegradable mulches can help increase their decomposition over time and speed up the breakdown of biodegradable plastics. So I don't have time to talk in detail about biodegradable plastics, but they're definitely not in their current form a panacea for this plastic pollution problem, because what we see is that their turnover in the soil is not fast enough. They sit around for too long to probably be viable in a commercial space. And so I can talk to you guys more if you guys are interested in that. One thing we have done since the study that I just talked a little bit about was published is go and sample more fields. And so these fields are anonymized because we're trying to we're not poking a finger at any of these farmer stakeholders. They're doing the best job they can to be good stewards of the land, but this is just an inevitable consequence, as I said, of using plastic in agriculture. That plastic is building up. And what we found from some of the fields and farms we've sampled is that macroplastic fragments are accumulating in these farms at pretty high concentrations. And so we see plastics coming up to about 213,000 fragments, visible fragments per hectare on the surface in farms across the central coast of California. And this is just because of normal use of plastic over time in the fields. And you can see some of the variety of pieces that we've identified and pulled out using that transect sampling method. And right now, Dr. Tawari, my postdoc, is working on understanding the relationship between these larger particles and smaller particles in the soil environment. And what she has found is that there are quite a bit of microplastics. So we're still in the midst of this. I don't have a lot of data to share with you, but her preliminary work suggests that there's upwards of 352 plus particles, so smaller particles less than 2 millimeters per kilogram of dry soil in the soil environment, and probably magnitudes more than that once she can start to analyze those smaller size classes, which again is very complicated in the soil environment because of interference with other parts of the soil that make it difficult to detect these fibers and pieces of plastic. And so right now we're trying to understand the relationship between visible fragments and microplastics in the soil environment and agricultural soils, and understand whether those correlate with changes in soil quality, nutrient pools, microbial biomass, etc. We're also trying to understand in particular, and this is what Dr. Torre is working on, the interaction between microplastics and other contaminants in agricultural soils. And so there have been a number, again, of studies, very recent studies. This is 2020, 2021, 2020, showing that plastics are changing the absorption and desorption of heavy metals and pesticides in soils. And so again, from a human health perspective, this is concerning because if plastic accumulation in soils doesn't just directly affect the soil environment, but also serves as a mechanism for accumulating pesticides or heavy metals, this can again be really problematic from a human health perspective. And so she started some experiments looking at how microplastics that are commonly used in the fields and biodegradable plastics that are now being sold as a potential alternative are affecting the availability of heavy metals in the soil environment. So she's just starting to work on these experiments. So I don't have any data for you guys, but maybe next year I will. And so I guess I just want to end with a broad idea that I hope that this talk, and I know it's a little bit fast, it's a lot of information for 40 minutes, helps you think about more reflective consumption to reduce the plastic burden. And so this was just an article written by the Sierra Club magazine. It's available online, that they interviewed my lab and some other folks about the use of plastic in agriculture. And I will say, as someone who's lived in California for a long time, I would pass fields without really thinking about what is applied to them and where it goes after until I really started this project. So, you know, I was in my 30s before I said to myself, like, wait a second, like, that's a lot of plastic going on in the soil. And I think that in order to be able to deal with the plastic pollution burden, we have to find viable alternatives for the farming community, because we expect to have beautiful, tasty strawberries, tomatoes, and other fruits basically year round, right? We, as consumers, we have this expectation. And then we also need to think about being more conscientious, I think, of consumers as the whole cycle of production, and not just that a clamshell at the end gets thrown in the garbage after you eat a box of fruit, but that there's a whole cycle of plastic that goes into the production of food, and to be really conscientious of where your food comes from, and to advocate for alternatives that will reduce this plastic pollution burden, because it affects everyone on earth, human and otherwise. And so with that, I want to thank you guys, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Hey, thank you for that talk. Do you guys have any questions for her?
I actually have one.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
That was an amazing talk. I had a question. You mentioned that these microplastics can like build up in worms, and the worms can be eaten by chickens, which can then build, are eaten by humans. Like, do you know like how long, like what happens when these microplastics have entered our bodies? Like, how long do they build up in there? Like,
Yeah. So my understanding is that microplastics are now being detected in people's gut tissues, in their lungs. There have been a number of studies that have shown that like people who have passed away with autopsies, they can find plastic particles in different parts of us. In terms of the effects, you know, I think it's not clear right now, right? Like, you know, I think from a precautionary principle, one would not want to have plastic accumulating inside their body or inside their cells. But because the detection of these materials is so new, right, at these scales, at these micro and nano scales, being able to link the presence of these materials with the consequences of these materials is really at the forefront of the science. But I do say, and from a precautionary principle, which is like an idea that, you know, you use the best knowledge at the time to try to sort of create regulation. We wouldn't want to be accumulating plastics if we can avoid it. Again, I also urge you all to think about sort of like what I said in the beginning, the rate of plastic production, like the amount of plastic produced, right? Half of the plastic on Earth, right, is from the last 20 or so years. And so in your lifetime, right, like we've had this explosion of plastic in the environment, which was not there before. And so the health consequences of that are going to be something we're going to be seeing for years out at this point. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of did have a question. So when you're adding, so obviously we see like these effects, how it's affecting like the invertebrate communities and like the soil, the respiration in the soil and all that stuff. But do you know if there's like any studies showing like how, like after the removal of these plastics in the soil, like how long would it take for the soil to go like back, I guess, back to normal?
Yeah. Normal is a hard word, especially with agricultural soils, because they're tilled and they're fertilized and they're fumigated and they have a lot of stuff going on in addition to the application of the plastics or the material that builds up. What we see is that once plastics are in the soil environment, they're not decomposing, right? They're functionally not decomposable. So they can break down, they can degrade into smaller pieces through either physical fragmentation or, you know, damage through, you know, light exposure. Like you see like plastics becoming more brittle, for instance, when they're exposed to light for long periods. But those smaller particles could be there, you know, for decades to centuries to functionally millennia. So in terms of the getting back to normal, I think the idea is that, again, like we have added a lot of plastic to our soil environments. We know this now. And the question is, how do we reduce that continued burden as quickly as possible? And whether we can get back to normal or not, I mean, people are growing things, right? You know, like people are really adaptive at growing things under really difficult conditions. We see this also with water supplies, right? Like, I mean, where you guys are in Southern California, the salt on fields, right? You see the crystallization on fields because of that more saline groundwater that's being used to irrigate fields. And yet we still grow things. But I think the idea is that given the knowledge now that plastic is accumulating at pretty incredible concentrations in these soils, and that it probably does have deleterious effects on soil biology, how can we reduce this material quickly? And that's why there's been a big push for biodegradable plastics. So these are still artificial plastic polymers. They're not necessarily biologically derived, but they're designed in such a way that the molecules can be cleaved and decomposed by microorganisms, so that it doesn't require like an evolutionary step to be able to decompose this material.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions? Okay, I do have like another question I was kind of curious about. So because I know you kind of mentioned like you really didn't like think about like, you know, plastics before, especially like in agriculture. Like what kind of like how were you exposed into like this field and like studying plastics in the soil?
Yeah, when I came to Cal Poly, so Cal Poly has a lot of agricultural land, and we're surrounded by agricultural land. And so I became curious because a colleague at another university was working on these biodegradable plastics to start working in this area, just because it was here and there was clearly a lot of plastic being applied to the landscape at the time when I came. And then when we were out in the field, you know, doing this project that had nothing, it wasn't about quantifying macroplastic pollution. It was like we weren't trying to like count the number of particles on the surface. That wasn't the original goal of the research. But once we were out here, my graduate student and I were just like, gee, there's a lot of plastic in like just in the soil, you know, like a lot. And we're like, how much is there? And it was just from curiosity. And then when we would pick up the material, we saw that, you know, the plastic was aggregating soil onto it, right? So like soil was glomming onto the plastic. And that was where the question of like, well, how does soil that's being attached or adheres to this plastic behave versus the soil that is not directly in contact with visible fragments? And again, that doesn't mean that soil isn't in contact with lots of microplastics. It's just the visible we were curious, like, there's been a lot of work on microplastics. It's in the news a lot now, but the larger fragments, hardly anyone was talking about what was going on there, except in the context of like animals ingesting them. And so we were just curious, and that's where that came from. And now it's evolved. So I have work with the like USDA and CDFA and a bunch of other collaborators evolving this project, both in terms of the plastic pollution part and also looking at biodegradable alternatives, and also end of life. Like if we are going to have plastic in ag, which we do for good reason, you know, what are other scenarios to try to reuse or reformulate this material? And actually, it was just on the cover of the magazine, and it's been covered in a couple of magazines now, that this recognition that there's like a whole lot of plastic going into agricultural production, and like there has to be some thinking about what the next step is other than just throwing it out and, you know, tilling the field and forgetting about it. But again, the farmers are not bad stewards. Like they're not like, well, we want to destroy the soil. They're using they're making a choice, right, between different alternatives, and the alternative of not using plastic, like for instance with strawberries, if there is no alternative. Like we can't find a single strawberry producer who doesn't use plastic, not one. So it's not, you know, given that is the technology at this point, what are we going to do about it? That's where we're at right now.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any more questions. Well, thank you again. Like I definitely did learn a lot today on plastics. That's kind of like what you have said it on your talk before. Is like you never really thought about it before. But it's definitely now on my mind now. Like every time when I see it, I'm gonna start thinking about it.
Yeah.
So it's definitely very, very informative. And it's kind of like a good way for you guys, for people to start thinking about like, okay, what's the next step? What can we do?
And I urge you guys, I think some of you are students in the room. Are there students in the room?
I think the students that left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's the Southern California Academy of Sciences. Is there the chair is local in Long Beach. She's at the Moore Institute, and there's other sort of ways for folks to get involved. So if the students are interested in sort of this issue, there's definitely stuff going on locally right now in Long Beach that I can link you to so that you can reach out to them, because I mean it's literally right by your door. There's a lot of work going on plastic pollution in the environment.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I'll definitely I'll probably shoot you an email so you can send me all that information.
Perfect.
So I can, you know, share that information.
Perfect.
So I'm pretty sure some of the students will be very interested in that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And
Thank you.
yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any other questions or anything. Okay. I hope it wasn't too dense. I'm not exactly sure. So
no, it was great. I definitely did learn a lot.
Okay, excellent. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.